The book of Galatians, what is it talking about? Do we really understand? Greetings, I'm David Brett here with John Fisher bringing you Revealing the Truth. Today we want to be like a Berean. We want to understand what Yahweh's Word is saying to us, and we need to take in context the historical background and especially scriptural background. What does Scripture say? Because ultimately we will be judged by the Word. And so we need to understand what it is. And Paul, in the book of Galatians, makes his point very clear that we had better be awake to what is right versus what is wrong. Galatians 1, 8 through 9 says, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you an evangel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you an evangel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed." Okay? Double emphasis. This is very, very important. So we need to understand what is being said here. The idea, of course, has been presented that, well, this is talking about law. It says law throughout. And so, he must be talking about the law being put away. And in Messiah, we no longer need to do that. We need not even do circumcision. And so these type of things are being brought up.
Yeah, you mentioned there are basically two things that we need to understand, what the Scripture says, but also the historical context. Mm-hmm. Why understand the history? If the Bible is true, then why do we need to understand the history? And, well, the answer is because Hebrews have a different culture than we do. They see things differently than we do. And it's kind of obvious that what people are doing today is they're reading the New Testament and then trying to take what they read in the New Testament to understand the Old Testament. But it doesn't work that way. The Old Testament, the Torah, the writings, the prophets are the foundation for the New Testament. And if we don't understand what the law says, what the prophets say, and what the writings are all about, and who wrote them and who they're writing to, then it's really difficult to get a grasp of what the New Testament is talking about. Hebrews think differently than we do. Today we kind of think like the Greeks and the Romans do. Philosophy sets it up for people to argue back and forth because they want to find the truth. Mm-hmm. Philosophy is a study of truth. But of course in philosophy we understand that there's a whole spectrum of how truth is defined. It can be everyone's thoughts are true, or one thought is true, and people are trying to find that. But Hebrews think differently. Yeah. They think concretely, and whatever the Scripture says, that's true. And if there's an apparent contradiction in Scripture, it's only apparent. It's apparent because we don't understand what the people were saying, who they were speaking to. And Galatians is a perfect example of that. Because for example, we read in Galatians 3, chapter 13, Messiah has redeemed us from the curse of the law. It's like, well, the law is a curse, therefore. No, that's not what it's talking about. By disobeying the law, there is a curse. The law itself is not a curse. And we'll get into this in more detail, I'm sure.
Well, as we think about knowledge and relativism, and then the idea that we can decide what is right for ourselves, that gets into Gnosticism, which Paul had to deal with also over in Colossians. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not necessarily what he's dealing with in Galatians, but in Colossians 2 and verse 20, in fact, he starts out talking about elementary principles of the world. And he talks about dogma or decrees, but these are of men. For example, 21 says, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use in accordance to the commandments and teachings of men. Verse 22 there. Verse 23 goes into self-made religion and self-abasement, severe treatment of the body. We even see this today being taken and put towards Christianity, for example, and self-abasement, these type of things, where during times of like Easter, people flog themselves and say, well, this is the way we want to worship the Father. Well, the Father tells us the way He wants us to worship Him. So it gets back to what He thinks and what He says and what He tells us to do versus what we think is right, what we want to do, what we'll tell ourselves we want to do. There's a difference. And when we go back to historical reference, the Galatia, they were in a polytheistic society. So was Colossians, but they were dealing with the Gnostics there. In Galatians, Paul was dealing with something different. In Galatians 4 and verses 10 through 11, he says, you observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. Now, with all the law that's mentioned throughout Galatians, we think, well, that's referring to Yahweh's laws. Well, obviously, it's not referring to polytheistic laws. It's not referring to Gnostic laws. It's referring to Yahweh's instructions, aren't they? Well, that's taken, and this is looked at then to be Yahweh's days, months, seasons, and years, because everyone knew about the feast and Sabbaths, these type of things. But this is dealing with pagan days, months, seasons, and years from the influence of the pagan society. People were going back rather than going forward, going back into pagan ways. Now that was one issue with the Galatians, or with the Galatian brethren. They were being influenced by these pagan ways. Now what we want to do is look at the overall, what was really the issue, and the main issue with Paul was these Judaizers, as he's, I think, referring to them as, coming in and saying, well, look, you have to be circumcised according to the law of Moses, and you have to do everything according to the law of Moses. Okay, what does that include? Everything. Well, there are certain aspects of the law, commandments, that we need to understand. Circumcision, from what we've been able to find out, is something similar to the sacrificial aspects, in the sense that they viewed the circumcision as a sacrifice for the individual, but it was to be in covenant with an Abrahamic covenant from before, which gave promises of land and to be a part of the family and these type of things. So with that in mind, let's see what Paul says here. Going on, we find in Galatians 3, 1 through 3, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before our very eyes, Yahshua Messiah was clearly portrayed as impaled. I would like to learn just one thing. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law, or by believing what you had heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, you are now trying to finish by means of the flesh? What is he saying? We have to consider the historical context back at this time. The temple was standing. This is around 45 to 55 CE. Okay, the temple wasn't destroyed until 70. And what these covenant keepers were doing is they were recognizing, you need to be circumcised according to the law of Moses. You need to do physical sacrifices, to do these things that were made to justify you before Yahweh. And that's how they recognize these things. And so that goes back into the Levitical priesthood. Hebrews 7, verses 11 through 12. Let's see if we can learn a little bit about this. If perfection could be attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there still a need for another priest to come in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? For when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. Okay? It's not that Yahweh changed. Out of necessity, there was a change in the law. Now, what was this law? When we look at the scripture, we have to understand, and this is inspired, there's no question that this is important for us to determine what we should be doing today. But if we look at Galatians 3 and let's start verse 18 and going through 20. For if the inheritance is based on law, it is no longer based on the promise, but Elohim has granted it to Abraham by means of a promise. Why the law then? It was added because of transgressions, having been ordained through angels by the agency of a mediator until the seed would come to whom the promise had been made. Now, a mediator is not for one party only, whereas Elohim is only one. Now, we have to expand this further, but the point here is there is a law that was added. Now, what law was added? And why was it added? Well, when you go back to Adam and Eve, one of the first things that happened after they sinned was an animal had to be killed. They were given clothing from the skins of animals. And even this process of sacrifices occurred even with their children. Abel sacrificed, offered an offering to Yahweh. And Cain didn't, and Cain got all upset and murdered, and he just wasn't doing what was right in Yahweh's sight. But ultimately the law, the Levitical priesthood laws of sacrifice, purification rites, these type of things were implemented and established within the law of Moses. Okay, so it was solidified, it was firm in the law. But now there's a new priesthood coming under the order of Melchizedek, not under the order of Levitical. Now, does that mean that all of it is done away with? No. The commandments have always been established. Not the law that was added, mind you, but the law's commandments. We find Abraham obeying the law, the statutes, the commandments, the way of Yahweh. You read of that in Genesis 26. You find that was before Mount Sinai. You find even the Israelites coming out of Egypt had the testimony with them. And most scholars recognize the testimony was at the very minimum the Ten Commandments. And so these are some things that we have to consider and think about and understand what they were doing in the first century. They were doing physical sacrifices. There was a Levitical priesthood. People were sacrificing animals to try to be justified before Yahweh.
Did you know that the words immortal and soul are never found together in the Bible? Did you know that the Bible teaches that the soul that sins will die? The fact is, the idea of an immortal soul is man's idea. The Bible, however, does teach of a resurrection from the dead. To learn more, request your free mini-study, Do You Have an Immortal Soul? Write to YAIY, 2963 County Road 233, Kingdom City, Missouri 65262, or visit us online at yaiy.org. You may also call us toll-free 1-877-642-4101. Eliah will come and restore all things before the second coming of Yahshua the Messiah. What does this mean? Find the answer to this question by receiving our free pamphlet, This is the Eliah Message. To do this, visit us online at www.yaiy.org or write to YAIY 2963 County Road 233, Kingdom City, Missouri 65262, or call us toll-free at 1-877-642-4101.
It was understood during the first century, while the temple was standing, while the Levitical priesthood was active, that there were things that the people would need to do, like purification rites, mikvahs, that there were sacrifices, bloodletting of the animals. That blood is something that we do not need to be having for ourselves to be justified before Yahweh. Yahshua's sacrifice, his blood, is what covers us today in another agreement. And the circumcision was a token of the blood covenant that was cut with Abraham back in Genesis 15. It's important to start putting these things together and understand the historical context, because if we don't, we'll get lost in the commentaries and of those that have decided that, yeah, Yahweh's instructions, those laws, even the feast days, you don't have to do those. And they'll point to Galatians and they'll say that these were weak and worthless, elemental type things. But what is being spoken of in that aspect of this whole book is the pagan practices that some of the Galatian brethren were evidently falling back into. He addressed that, just as he addressed things in Corinth, 1 Corinthians. It's not just one thing, it was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different types of things that had to be addressed. Paul here is basically addressing two major things, and he also addresses the fact that they're not to be arguing amongst each other and debating and biting and devouring one another. But it's important that the false doctrines that were coming in be stopped and be taken out and apart, because we and they were to be holy, set apart, not to be mixed. One of the problems that we see today is ecumenicalism, and it's a problem because, well, if you focus on love and grace and faith and all these things and do away with the law, then there is no standard other than a feeling or an emotion and wanting to just be happy and joyful. Well, those are things of the Spirit for sure, but the Spirit is not against. In fact, it gets into Galatians 5, it says there's no laws against having the fruits of the Spirit, because those fruits of the Spirit are even what the law produces itself. If I don't steal from you, if I don't commit adultery, if I don't dishonor Yahweh's name, then I'm not dishonoring his instructions. I'm not going outside of the realm of his Spirit, and I'm not producing different fruit. But if I'm lying, cheating, stealing, dishonoring Yahweh by not keeping his Sabbath, for example, the weekly Sabbath, and I'm forgetting it, well, then I'm going outside of the Spirit. Yeah, I'm going outside of the law.
It's interesting to see Christian pastors speaking in favor of the Ten Commandments, but then not following them. I mean, and in human nature, if we know that we're doing something wrong, we're going to end up feeling guilty. And it's my personal belief that people know that the Sabbath is on Saturday. I mean, you can just read it in Scripture and go to a dictionary, look up Saturday. What's the seventh day of the week? But if we are feeling guilty, even subconsciously or even unconsciously, what are we going to do with our guilt? Are we going to make a change? Typically not. We're going to blame someone else or create some rationality that allows us to not feel guilty about what we're doing. And what I see is people rationalizing their behavior because they don't want to change. You can imagine any pastor who understands that they should be worshiping Yahweh on the seventh day of the week, to proclaim that to the board of directors of any particular church, he'd be fired. He'd lose his job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea that Paul was against the law or against the Spirit is just foreign. In fact, Yahweh is looking for those that will worship him in spirit and in truth. And it's obviously his spirit and his truth. Paul says, brethren, if anyone is caught in a trespass, in Galatians 6 and verse 1, You who are spiritual, and the emphasis is on the spiritual throughout this book. He says, each one looking to themselves so that you too will not be tempted. In other words, the laws were still active. Otherwise, what would be a trespass? I mean, if we can just make up our own morality, then we can do whatever we would like. Mm-hmm. But that's not what was understood. In Galatians 5 and verse 13, it says, do not turn your freedom, your release from sin, because that's what Yahshua came to do. He came to forgive us of our past sins. That's what his sacrifice was for. And it was a perfect sacrifice. It was not like the Levitical priesthood sacrifices in which it was a continual circle. You'd have, speaking of Hebrew thought, I mean, you'd have to go back and continue because it would never really change the individual's heart. But today, we're given a spirit that does change our heart so that we will be obedient. That was the prophecy, and it brings that out in the book of Hebrews. Goes back to Jeremiah 31. Ezekiel 36, 26, and 27 talks about the Spirit being given to change the heart, the stony heart of the individual, to heart of flesh, one that is sensitive to Yahweh's word and to his Spirit. And so therefore will be more intent in wanting to honor Yahweh and not wanting to disobey Yahweh. And it gets back to what our Father wants. Even Yahshua, said, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good but him." So he defaulted to him as well, and he himself followed his will. And he says, "Look, you'll know if my doctrines are my own, because they'll be either my Father's doctrines or someone else's." They were his Father's teachings. And that's what we need to get back to. But there was a law that was added, the law of sacrifice. And the circumcision was a sign of the blood token of the previous cutting of the covenant. With Messiah, those that accept his blood have accepted his cutting of the covenant anew for us today. So, is it confusing? Yeah, somewhat, but we get back to the basics and we start to understand. We get back to the historical context. We begin to understand. Hebrews 7, 18 through 19. For the former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless, for the law made nothing perfect. And a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to Yahweh. Okay, the whole law was useless. That's not what it's saying. The law that was added, the one that people would seek justification in, that was not helping because the people's hearts were not changing. And so when we look at the prophecies, when we look at the historical context, when we see what Yahweh is doing, and it's still in process. It's been in process since Acts chapter 2, in which the Spirit was initially given. But it doesn't give license, like Paul says, to go back and start sinning. Shall we now that we abound in grace, shall we sin so that we may abound in grace? Yahweh forbid, he says. And he clarifies himself in a number of areas. But when you see Paul's writings, there's different areas. 1 Corinthians, dealing with the Passover and unleavened bread and the Master's Supper there. 1 Corinthians 5, 7 through 8. Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch, as you really are. For Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival or the feast, not with old bread that's leavened, with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. He's working all these things in. Not only is he saying, look, keep the feast. Now that you have to keep in mind, these were Greeks he was dealing with. These were Gentiles. He's telling them to keep the feast? Well, yes, because the feasts are not done away with. We can still worship him with the calves of our lips at the appointed times that he tells us to come before him. These are moral aspects of the law. It's morally good to worship him when he says, come and worship him. But that law that was added, the sacrifices, we don't have even a Levitical priesthood set up today, though they are in training in Jerusalem. Out in the Negev desert, they have a temporary tabernacle that they set up, and they are working in the implements and these things, the laver and they even have the menorah and these type of things. So we do find that prophecy tells us that in Ezekiel 40 and on that there is going to be a temple established in the coming kingdom, that there is going to be the priesthood reestablished. But for those in Messiah, if we overcome to the end, we will be sitting with Yahshua on his throne in that same kingdom. We will not be the physical people that will be learning Yahweh's ways. And they're going to have to learn that sin has consequences, that sin causes death. And if anything was taken away from us, it's the death penalty in Messiah. But it's important to understand what the book of Galatians is focused on here. It's talking about the circumcision. It's talking about being in that original covenant and then having to do those things which were added because of the law to try to be justified in Messiah. Galatians, and Paul in Galatians makes it very clear. Verse 16 of Galatians 2. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but through the faith in Messiah Yahshua. Even we have believed in Messiah Yahshua, so that we may be justified by faith in Messiah, and not by works of the law. Since the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. But if, while seeking to be justified in Messiah, we ourselves have also been found sinners in Messiah, or have been found sinners, is Messiah then a minister of sin? Yahweh forbid. May it never be. In other words, yeah, there can be a time in which we slip up and are in error, and hopefully someone will help us to be corrected from that error. I think that's what the Spirit is ultimately for, because it leads us into all truth, and it helps us to be coming to a perfection in Messiah. And Messiah is to grow within us. We are to allow the Spirit to dominate our lives. But to say that we can now steal, cheat, and lie, that Yahweh forbid. That is not in line with His Word. And ultimately His Word trumps what we would ourselves believe. But we have to take a look at Galatians in context of the historical account, in context of the laws that were added. And for the physical people, those things will be done in the coming kingdom, but as training, as a tutor, schoolmaster for the people, so that they will learn. We are learning right now in Messiah that those things are not for us.